Imagine waking up in a city where the sirens have become part of the morning routine. You check your phone, not for messages from friends, but for overnight strike reports. You look at a map and realize that, somewhere far away, people you will never meet are quietly discussing which parts of your country you should give up, where the new lines on that map should be drawn, and how many soldiers you are allowed to have to defend your home. That is what this new Trump-backed peace proposal for Ukraine feels like to many Ukrainians and Europeans right now. On paper, it is called a 28-point plan to end the war. In reality, for the people whose lives are on the line, it sounds less like peace and more like being asked to survive with your hands tied behind your back. Welcome to GNN. Today we are breaking down what this plan actually is, what it demands from Ukraine, why Washington's allies are alarmed, and why Kyiv so far is refusing to get on board. As you listen, picture the places, the borders, and the people we are talking about, because this is not just about abstract diplomacy. This is about homes, language, faith, and survival. Let's start with the core of the proposal. The Trump administration has quietly worked with a small circle of advisors and a Russian interlocutor to put together a 28-point framework to end the war Russia launched with its full-scale invasion of Ukraine almost 4 years ago. The heart of it is simple and brutal. Ukraine would have to give up the rest of the eastern Donbas region, including areas that are still under Ukrainian control. Battle lines in other occupied parts of the south would be frozen roughly where they are now, locking in Russian control over a massive slice of Ukrainian territory. In exchange, the United States would offer security guarantees for Ukraine and Europe. On paper, these guarantees are supposed to deter future Russian attacks and reassure nervous European capitals that this would not just be a pause before the next assault. But to get those guarantees, Ukraine would have to pay an enormous price. Visually, think of a map of Ukraine. Highlight the eastern industrial heartland of Donbas. Show it in 2 colors. One for the land Russia already occupies, another for the land still held by Ukraine that this plan suggests should be surrendered. Then pull back and shade the swath of eastern and southern Ukraine currently under Russian control. That is the territory this framework would effectively seal in place. The plan does not stop at land. It also reaches into Ukraine's basic right to defend itself. According to reports, Ukraine would have to reduce the size of its armed forces and roll back some of its military capabilities, including certain advanced systems that have been crucial for holding the line and protecting cities from Russian attacks. Imagine the Ukrainian army as a shield that has been battered but is still standing. This proposal asks Ukraine to hand the enemy a piece of the country and then agree to shrink that shield, trusting that written promises from another capital will be enough to keep the same enemy from coming back. For the people drafting this framework in Washington and the Russian side feeding ideas into it, this is presented as realism, a painful compromise to stop a grinding war. For many Ukrainians and Europeans, it feels like déjà vu. European diplomats who have seen or been briefed on the details say it brings back many of Moscow's maximalist demands from early 2022. Demands that were already rejected during the Istanbul talks in the first weeks of the full-scale invasion. Territory handed over in Donbas, limits on Ukraine's alliances, limits on its army. Even provisions touching on the status of the Russian language and the Russian Orthodox Church inside Ukraine after the war. If you are watching this, picture a timeline graphic on screen. On one end, Istanbul, 2022. Talks where Russia pushes sweeping demands. On the other end, reports in late 2025 of this new 28-point plan. Between them, years of destruction, flattened cities, mass graves, missile strikes on civilian neighborhoods. And yet, somehow, Kyiv is being asked to revisit ideas that it already said no to before all of that suffering. The reaction from inside Ukraine has been as clear as it is emotional. Ukrainian officials say any plan that rewards aggression with land is not a path to peace, but an invitation for Russia to regroup and return. For a Ukrainian leader, agreeing to hand over a fortified region like Donbas is described as political suicide and militarily reckless. It would mean abandoning people who still live under Ukraine's flag and pushing the front line closer to the country's heart. Side by side with this resistance from Kyiv is a deep sense of unease across European capitals. Diplomats in Europe say they were blindsided. Foreign ministries scrambled to call contacts in Washington, only to hear that even many in the U.S. government had not been fully briefed before the plan leaked into the press. People who believed they would be part of any serious effort to end the war found themselves reading headlines instead. You can imagine the image here. A split screen. On one side, European foreign ministers stepping up to microphones in Brussels or Warsaw, saying any viable peace plan has to include Europe and has to preserve Ukraine's ability to defend itself. On the other side, text of reports describing a proposal heavily shaped by US and Russian figures, with Kyiv and Europe watching from the outside. The European Union's foreign policy chief has already warned that any successful plan must have the support of Ukrainians and Europeans. Poland's foreign minister has stressed that Europe has more at stake in this war than the United States and must be fully involved. These are not just protocol complaints. For countries that live within missile range of Russia, the shape of any deal with Moscow is a question of survival. At the center of the American side of this story is Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff. Reports say he worked directly with a Russian advisor, Kirill Dmitriev, to produce the 28-point framework, including during a face-to-face meeting in Miami. This is not traditional state-to-state diplomacy in public view. It is a small channel, operating quietly, trying to draft reality for millions of people. Meanwhile, the violence on the ground has not stopped to wait for diplomats. Even as this plan was being discussed, Russian missiles were still hitting Ukrainian cities. One of the most harrowing recent attacks struck an apartment building in the western city of Ternopil, killing at least 26 people, including children. Rescuers pulled bodies from burned-out apartments while, in parallel, U.S. officials visited Kyiv to talk about air defenses and this prospective peace deal. Think of the contrast visually. On one side, footage of rescuers picking their way through blackened concrete, smoke still rising, teddy bears and kitchen tables buried under rubble. On the other side, polished conference rooms, flags lined up behind officials talking about frameworks and guarantees. That gap between lived reality and diplomatic language is where much of the anger in Ukraine comes from. President Volodymyr Zelensky has been consistent in his public message. The war must end, but in his words, there can be no reward for waging war. Freezing the conflict on current lines with Russia holding such a large portion of Ukrainian territory is from Kyiv's perspective not a fair compromise, but a coerced surrender of everything that has been fought for since 2014 and especially since 2022. Supporters of the plan argue that no peace is ever perfect, and that real negotiations mean giving up painful things. They point to US security guarantees as a historic step, something that could bring Ukraine closer to the West in ways that might not have been possible before. They frame the territorial concessions as the last necessary sacrifice to stop a war that has already cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But there is a question at the heart of this debate. What does peace mean if the people living on the front line do not accept the terms? For Ukrainians who remember the promises made after Crimea was seized in 2014, the idea of trading more land for paper guarantees feels like repeating a familiar mistake. For Europeans on NATO's eastern flank, a deal that weakens Ukraine's military and leaves Russia in control of a huge occupied zone looks less like the end of a war and more like the first chapter of the next one. If you are watching and trying to make sense of this, here is how to picture the stakes. Show a family in eastern Ukraine packing what little they can carry into a car, knowing that if their region is officially handed over, their language, schools, and loyalties may suddenly be treated as suspect. Show a Ukrainian soldier standing in a trench near Donbass, wondering how he is supposed to tell his comrades that the ground they bled for is now part of a bargain struck far from the front. Show a European policymaker staring at a map of NATO's eastern border, calculating how close Russian forces would be positioned to major European cities if this becomes the new normal. And then show a negotiator in a quiet room, convinced that all of these fears can be calmed with the right blend of clauses and guarantees. That is the collision we are watching. On one side, a U.S. administration eager to present a dramatic diplomatic victory, an end to a war Trump once promised to resolve on his first day in office. A chance to stand on a stage and say that, finally, the killing is over. On the other, a country that has already buried so many of its people that the idea of signing away more of its territory feels like betraying the dead. A region of Europe that has learned again and again that the wrong kind of peace can be as dangerous as war. Allies who want to believe in Washington's intentions, but fear that a deal negotiated above their heads will leave them exposed. For now, the 28-point plan is just that, a plan. Ukraine has not agreed to it. European governments are openly pushing back. Even within the United States, not everyone involved in foreign policy appears to have been consulted. There is confusion, anger, and a sense that something this consequential is being assembled too quickly and too quietly. But the very fact that this proposal exists tells us something. The pressure to find an exit from this war is rising, especially in Washington. As the conflict grinds on, the temptation to accept almost any deal that can be labeled peace grows stronger. For Ukrainians and many Europeans, the challenge is to make sure that peace does not come at the cost of their future. So where does this leave us? It leaves Ukraine fighting on, determined not to legitimize the occupation of its land. It leaves European leaders insisting that any real settlement has to include them and protect Ukraine's right to defend itself. And it leaves the United States walking a narrow line between its desire for a diplomatic breakthrough and the risk of forcing its allies into a deal they see as unacceptable. In the end, maps and documents matter. But so does consent. A peace plan imposed on a country that feels cornered is unlikely to hold. We will keep following how Kyiv, Moscow, Washington, and European capitals respond as the details of this 28-point proposal become clearer, and as the war on the ground continues to shape what is politically and morally possible. You have been watching GNN. Stay safe, stay informed, and look closely at the fine print whenever someone promises peace.